Hello and welcome to the Team 5 podcast. I'm your host, Scott Tyree, and today we are going to be looking at alcohol use disorder and the pandemic. We will be interviewing 3 people about their experience during the pandemic from 3 different points of view. The first interview is Ruthie, who is a therapist and has dealt with hundreds of people dealing with alcohol use disorder. The second interview will be Bob, who's 67 years old and began his recovery at the start of the pandemic. And the final interview is Mike, who also began his recovery into the pandemic somewhat. Mike does deal with alcohol, but also heroin and opiates are his thing, but they work together. So without further ado, we will get started. I am here with Ruthie, who's a licensed mental health counselor. What percentage would you say of your clients deal with alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder?
I'd say probably 25%.
25%. And so how long have you had that practice?
I've been in private practice since 2013, but prior to that I worked in the substance abuse field, working for someone since 2009.
So we are talking today about specifically alcohol use disorder and the pandemic. And so just wanted to talk to you about your experience. And I guess maybe just give, someone comes into your office pre-pandemic dealing with alcohol. What does that look like versus today? Are there any real major changes?
There's definitely a shift. Along with most of the people who walk in with substance use or alcohol use disorder right now, post-pandemic or even during the pandemic, that coincided with a significant amount of anxiety and depression. So it wasn't a typical alcohol use disorder presentation. It actually had a lot of other effects. And once I would do the initial intake, one of the things that I found out is there was also a tremendous amount of isolation that was different. Prior to the pandemic, most of my people who came in with alcohol use disorder would go out a lot. They'd go out to the bars or the clubs, or they'd spend time with friends drinking. And when they got to a point where they were drinking by themselves, they would still be out a lot, and that in some way would lead to a lot more legal issues, which would get them help quicker. So I would get someone who got a DWI, or they were out, got into a bar fight or something like that. But during the pandemic and post-pandemic, because there was so much isolation, I find that the clients that I got were much sicker or much further in their progression.
That's interesting. How has your experience been with Zoom and doing a lot of your meetings over Zoom versus seeing people in person pre-pandemic?
Well, I think it was not only necessary for people to get the care they need, but I definitely, it was very helpful for some clients that were struggling with leaving their home for them to get some type of care in their home. But of course, the downside is that limited the exposure therapy you can do. For a lot of clients with particularly with substance use disorder, they part of the treatment plan is increasing social support significantly. And when you Zoom a meeting, most meetings begin without socialization outside of the 2-minute introduction, and they end and you sign off. So a lot of the clients that I see that are participatory in either AA, Celebrate Recovery, NA, and other 12-step programs, they did not receive the same type of social support that you would get if you walked into a meeting. Sometimes you need help being driven there, or they go meet for coffee, or they sit for a half hour before the meeting started, or after the meeting they'd sit around and talk. So it's very different. So I think there's some upside and some downside. And of course, one of the harder parts too is over Zoom, there's some observations that you would normally make in somebody when they're face to face with regards to just subtle hints that somebody might not be forthcoming in that moment, or they might be feeling a kind of way that you might not see over Zoom or hear over Zoom. So that it just provides there's a little bit of safety for that person, but it gives a little bit too much distance sometimes for some of the intimacy that might come out in a session.
Yeah, thank you. Moving forward in this new climate that we have, which is kind of a hybrid climate, are there any changes that you would like to see or that you think would be important for clients that you have dealing with substance use disorder?
I definitely do. I would love to see some options to traditional program be made more available locally. So, for instance, you can get into an AA program just about anywhere at any time, but then if you move to like a Celebrate Recovery type of situation, they don't have as many around, and there might be 3 in the course of a week that might be 30 minutes or more to get to. So just seeing maybe some Zoom meetings be available through Celebrate Recovery, maybe some hybrid meetings that would allow an extra half hour at the beginning and an extra half hour at the end for socializing, where people could break into groups or smaller groups, or a promotion, maybe gathering outside of the meetings if there's going to be only hybrid meetings or Zoom meetings instead of face-to-face or group meetings. I would like to see that happen. I think I'd also like to see more groups, therapy groups for people with substance abuse issues. And if you go to a traditional treatment program, there's groups, but if you go to a clinician in private practice, most clinicians don't do group therapy. And so I think there's a missing component there for someone who might need some exposure or experience speaking in a group and having face-to-face time with other people who also have the same illness as them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ruthie. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Ruthie identified 3 big issues that she saw during the pandemic. The first was isolation was different. People weren't going out, kind of holed up in their homes, and it allowed the addiction to run its course further. And so people were coming into her sicker, which I would also echo that with my experience working in treatment. During that time, we certainly saw people coming in a lot sicker, and it wasn't just alcohol; it was anything. People had the opportunities, the means, and also, in some ways, the excuse, although I don't like to use that word, to continue on with their addiction in isolation in their homes. The second thing she saw was just limited exposure. So socialization is a really important thing for someone dealing with alcohol use disorder, especially in the early stages. And the pandemic limited the opportunities for that. And the third was that it was harder for treatment professionals to make observations over Zoom. So some of the things in the past that you'd pick up on that a client's speaking about with their body language, it was harder to identify those items.
Our next interview is with Bob, and Bob began his recovery journey right before the pandemic began. And so you'll hear that his experience is a little different than most. He was fortunate in some ways, but nonetheless did experience recovery from alcohol use disorder during the pandemic.
So I'm here with Bob. Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm 66 years old. I'm the oldest of 6 children, and I was born and raised in New York City.
And you were a police officer in the Bronx and Manhattan?
I was a police officer in the Bronx and Manhattan for 27 years.
And now you're a lieutenant? You ended as a lieutenant?
I retired as a lieutenant, yes.
Nice. So we are talking about alcohol use disorder and the pandemic. And so I guess just go back to that February, March, when you're first hearing rumblings about coronavirus. What was your life like at that point? As far as recovery goes, were you contemplating entering recovery? Were you in recovery?
I had gone back to a rehab, and that's when it really started to take off. And I remember when I left rehab and I came home, I thought I was in the Twilight Zone. I mean, rows and rows of stores were closed. People were wearing masks. Nobody, like, the streets were deserted. So it was really strange. I couldn't believe that in this country they would close churches and leave liquor stores open. I mean, I'm an alcoholic, and you're gonna tell me you're gonna leave the liquor stores open but close churches?
Yeah, I remember that too. But imagine if the liquor stores closed, it would be a disaster.
Yes.
There'd be rioting.
Yes.
And things would be being turned into alcohol. Like,
I guess we tried that in this country
strawberries.
once in Prohibition. It didn't go too well, so.
Um,
And then there are people that need alcohol to live.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fact, So.
yeah. And so you get home from rehab. You're isolated in your home. And so what does recovery look like for you during that time?
Well, by the time I had gotten home, I guess for a little while I was off, but my job didn't stop. So, it wasn't like I was one of these people that was stuck in the house. That probably would have been difficult. Well, first of all, I wouldn't have stayed in the house because I'm naturally a rule breaker. But, I was still able to work. I was driving methadone patients back and forth, and, COVID didn't have anything. I think, and even my AA group, a lot of AA groups shut down and they would only go Zoom, which, listening to people afterwards, a lot of people they don't like the computers, they didn't like the Zoom, they didn't feel like the computers didn't do it for them. But again, I was in sort of a different, my group stayed open. The church that we were at, a lot of the churches closed, but this church said we could do it under certain circumstances. We had to do it in the church, separated, but they stayed open. So I know that if I wouldn't have done Zoom, I just didn't, So I was fortunate in that matter because, definitely AA helps me stay sober.
Would you say your AA group was an older group?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so do you think that's could be a generational thing where the older folks, struggle more with the Zoom than the younger? Like, was it just getting on the computer and doing all those things?
It wasn't so much my group because we didn't do Zoom, but when it opened back up again, and people visit different meetings in general, and you'd hear different people say, yeah, I didn't like the Zoom, it was terrible for me. A lot of people, some people relapsed, but I didn't hear from my group because we were open, so we went,
Yeah. So you didn't have to deal with the isolation as much since you were still working.
I was working, and I still had an AA group, yeah.
Yeah. So actually, this interview is not very useful to our project.
Well, I'm sorry I couldn't help you with that.
No, I'm just kidding. We're just, exploring a lot of different experiences. Yeah. If you had to project your life where let's say you didn't have that job, or you had a job that was shut down, and your home group stopped meeting in person, how do you think that would have affected your recovery?
I don't think it would have been good at all. I'm at my most vulnerable when I'm not doing something or when I'm alone. When I'm around people, it's sort of easy for me, and when I'm busy, it's sort of easy for me. It's like what I say, when you're left to your own devices, it doesn't go good. If I'm alone and I have nothing to do, I could readily figure out something to do, and it's generally not good. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. Yeah, that wouldn't have been good. Yeah, especially that another liquor stores are delivering. What are you kidding me? Thank God I wasn't around for that situation. They may still do. I don't know. So
yeah, I don't know either. Special thanks to Bob. He's a great guy and very open about his addiction, and I'm really pleased to call him a friend. Our next interview is with Mike, and he had a very different experience. So I'm here with Mike.
Hi.
And I've known Mike for about 14 months. Mike is going to talk to us about his pandemic experience.
I stayed home for a long time. I think it was all the way up until June.
Do you remember feeling lonely or, I guess negative feelings associated with isolation during that time? It's you, your wife and kids in the house? Or was that do you look back on that as do you look back on that with fond memories?
So over the progression of my use, I would provide for my family, but I wouldn't use at home. I wouldn't come home high. So, Daddy was always at work. So Daddy would come home, or not even come home. Daddy would go to the bank, put the money in for Mommy, and then Daddy would abandon everybody. So, I didn't want to live that way anymore, so I went to get the help. But now it was a whole new thing for me, being at home and being involved and seeing the hustle and bustle of, being a parent and I'm supposed to be a functioning adult here and do the right thing. And it was just really overwhelming for me to, I wasn't used to at that point they were 3 and 4. I wasn't used to the fighting all the time and, the neediness, and it was new for me. And I look back at it now and like how horrible for, my children and my wife to have to do that alone. And I have a huge respect for my wife for being able to do that, by herself. But it was really overwhelming. So it wasn't so much as, the isolation part, because I was with my family. It was just really like sensory overload times 100. And as the pandemic went on, like I said, we didn't really leave till June, and then June came, and I think it was maybe a couple weeks after like kind of getting out. It was just like I just needed a vacation, and my vacations turned into 3-year excursions by myself, and that's what I did. And I ran from my responsibilities as a father. I ran from all the crap that I had been trying to run from my whole entire life.
So talk about, what happened in June. Like you got that's when the stimulus checks started coming in.
They gave the unemployment money, but it was all retroactive. So my first bit of money was from February when they locked it down to June. So it was a good chunk of change. I remember the one day I was looking at the bank thinking, how are we going to do this? And then the next day there was like $11,000 in the bank account. And I'm like, sweet, okay. And I had it sent to my business bank account, so my wife didn't know anything. And so she, I was starting to have those addict behaviors again, the lying, and I knew I wanted to go use and get out of the house, but I knew that if I told her exactly how much money I had, that she would know if I was going to use. I really wanted to keep it under wraps this time. I was going to just, like I said, it was going to be a one night out thing, and I lied, and I think I went to go get, we had took my trailer to a campground, and I had to go get something from Home Depot, and I didn't come back for 3 days. But, without working and that taking up most of my time, it was strictly drug use at this point. It was running from my responsibilities as a father and running from my problems, and I focused all of my energy on drugs.
What were your attempts like during the pandemic, for help? Like, with meetings, did you attend Zoom meetings at all?
I tried the Zoom meetings. They weren't for me. Before I made the choice that, I was really trying to get this thing figured out. And when I can't be transparent and be open and honest with people because I'm afraid of what, if Uncle Joe's watching behind them, it was hard for me to be honest. And that's how I lived my whole life, is not being honest. So if I'm going to change, that's the only way it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Zoom meetings didn't work for me.
Yeah. And so, yeah, like we said, you've put together a good amount of sober time, families coming along and going well, kids are doing well.
Yeah.
We'd like to thank Mike for being vulnerable with his story, and I'd like to thank all you listeners as well for listening to the Team 5 podcast. Have a great night, and be sure to ask us a lot of questions.